They stole my retirement money and left me on the streets. Like a dog, they thought at 72 I couldn't fight back, but they'll regret it until their last day. The icy Chicago rain hammered my weathered face as I sat on that park bench, clutching the bank statement with trembling hands that shook more from rage than cold. Account closed by secondary holder, Michael Thompson. The boy I'd raised since he was 6 months old had drained my entire 401k in a single morning. 43 years of double shifts at the steel mill, every penny saved and sacrificed, reduced to zeros with one signature I'd foolishly authorized. But what truly shattered my soul wasn't the money. It was finding that cruel note taped to my apartment door before the eviction. "Grandpa, at your age, what do you need all that money for anyway? Find yourself a cheap nursing home and don't contact me again. You've served your purpose." They thought that at 72, I was just disposable trash, an easy obstacle to remove, a helpless old man who would quietly disappear into some corner to die. But they had awakened something that had been sleeping for decades in my chest. Something that today's young people don't understand, that we, the old wolves of our generation, carry embedded in our DNA. They're going to regret this until their last day, because they're about to discover that this old dog still has fangs. That first night under the Lower Wacker underpass, while the cold seeped into my bones and I listened to drug addicts fighting over territories, something crystallized in my mind with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose. The tears dried up and turned to pure ice, into a fury so cold it surprised even me. I remembered my father's words before he died in Vietnam. "Son, old wolves are the most dangerous because they've learned to hunt in silence." Michael had made the fatal mistake of underestimating a man who had survived the Detroit riots, 3 economic recessions, the loss of loved ones, and 4 decades working in the toughest neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Nobody expected that a betrayed grandfather would still have the capacity to roar. But that night, staring at the stars from my cardboard bed, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to systematically destroy everything Michael valued, piece by piece, until he begged for forgiveness he would never receive. After so many years, one learns that revenge isn't served hot or cold. It's served with the glacial patience of someone who has all eternity to plan the perfect destruction. How had I come to raise such a monster? 18 years ago, when my daughter Sarah showed up at my door, with that baby in her arms and tears in her eyes, my heart melted, seeing those green eyes that seemed to understand every word. "Dad, it'll just be for a few months while I get back on my feet." She had lied with that smile she inherited from her mother. Sarah never came back. She died 6 months later in what the police called an overdose, but I still suspect wasn't accidental, leaving me as the sole guardian of that baby who cried at night searching for a mother who was already ashes. At 54, I became a father again, but this time, with the wisdom and fear of someone who knows life can take everything away in a heartbeat. I changed my entire existence, sold my 3-bedroom house in Cicero, where I'd planned to age in peace, left my stable supervisor job at Republic Steel, took night shifts as a security guard that destroyed my back but gave me enough money to support Michael. Every dollar I earned working 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shifts turned into formula, diapers, clothes, medicine, toys, into materialized love for that child who had now stabbed me in the back. Anyone in my position would have raised that child with resentment, constantly reminding him of the sacrifice. But I chose to love him like the son I never had, believing that unconditional love would create a man of honor. How naive I was to think that goodness is inherited rather than earned. For years, Michael was my pride and my reason for living. At every parent-teacher conference, I was the brave grandfather who had single-handedly raised his grandson after tragedy struck. I took him to his soccer games with my chest swelling with pride, helped him with homework until late hours, taught him values I believed were being carved into his character, like chisel on marble. Teachers congratulated me on the polite and respectful boy I had formed. Neighbors admired my dedication. "That kid is so lucky to have a grandfather like you," they'd tell me. I smiled, believing I was building a legacy, that my sacrifice would be worth it when I saw Michael become a man of integrity. But when he turned 15 and started hanging out with kids from wealthy families at the private school I paid for by working 2 jobs, something changed in his eyes. He began to feel ashamed of our modest apartment, my worn clothes, the fact that I worked as a night security guard. Young people don't understand that we, people of our generation, measure success not by what we have, but by what we're capable of giving. Michael had learned to measure love by the price of things I could buy him, and when the things weren't enough, neither was the love. The breaking point came when Michael met Madison during his senior year at Northwestern University, a beautiful girl from a millionaire family who introduced him to a world where my grandson learned to feel shame about his origins. He began inventing stories about his past, saying his parents had died in an accident, but that he had a family inheritance that allowed him to live well. He never mentioned the grandfather who worked night shifts to pay for his private university, expensive textbooks, the used BMW I bought him so he could impress his new rich friends. "Grandpa, could you not come to my graduation? It's just that Madison's family will be there and they'll ask a lot of questions," he asked me with that fake smile he had perfected to manipulate me. I accepted, as always, because grandfathers of my generation believed love is demonstrated through silent sacrifice. We didn't know it could also be demonstrated by demanding respect and consequences. That day, while all the other graduates celebrated with their families, I stayed home watching the ceremony on TV, searching for his face in the crowd, and feeling proud despite the pain. At our age, one learns that sometimes loving means accepting being invisible. But I also learned that being invisible gives you advantages that the visible never suspect. After graduation, Michael married Madison in a ceremony I wasn't invited to. I found out through photos I saw on Facebook, where he appeared radiant next to a family he had bought with lies. For 2 years, I didn't receive a single call, a single visit, a single explanation. I had raised a ghost who carried my last name but not my emotional blood. During those lonely nights while working security in buildings where entire families slept peacefully, I wondered where I had failed, what I had done wrong to deserve this abandonment. People of our generation tend to blame ourselves for the failures of those we love, as if love could control the free choices of others. But deep in my heart, a dark seed began to germinate, the understanding that I had sacrificed my life for someone who didn't deserve it, and that realization would forever change how I saw the world. Anyone in my place would have started planning from that moment, but I still believed in miracles and second chances. The miracle came 3 months ago, but it turned out to be a curse in disguise. Michael appeared at my door after 2 years of total silence, gaunt, with deep dark circles, and that desperation in his eyes that I had seen before in compulsive gamblers and drug addicts I patrolled during my night shifts. "Grandpa, I need your help urgently," he told me with a voice trembling with anxiety. "I have an incredible business opportunity that could change our lives, but I need startup capital. Could you put me as a secondary holder on your retirement account? Just for security, so if something happens to you the money doesn't get complicated with legal procedures." His words sounded rehearsed, but my grandfather's heart, hungry for affection, melted, thinking he finally needed me again, that he had come back to find me after so much silence. I signed the papers without reading the fine print, believing I would finally get my grandson back and that my decades of emotional investment would finally bear fruit. Grandfathers are specialists at seeing what we want to see, especially when it comes to the grandchildren we raised as sons. That deliberate naivety cost me everything I had, but it also gave me the moral justification I needed for what I was about to do. A week later, my world collapsed with the precision of a controlled demolition. The empty account, the eviction notice, that cruel note that made it clear I had never been more than a personal bank with legs to him. But while packing my few belongings into cardboard boxes, I found something Michael had forgotten in his rush to escape. A folder with all the letters I wrote to him during his childhood. Photos of us together on every birthday, every Christmas, every first day of school, the drawings he made me as a child where we appeared holding hands under a smiling sun with the phrase, "My grandpa is my hero," written in colored crayons. There, holding the physical evidence of a love that had been real and had been betrayed, I understood with crystal clarity that I hadn't lost my grandson. I had raised a stranger who wore his face but not his soul. That realization freed me from any guilt about what I was about to plan. After so many years, one learns that there are betrayals that don't deserve forgiveness, but justice. And I had 72 years of experience in getting exactly what I set my mind to. The first days on the streets were a crash course in urban survival that reminded me of skills I thought I'd forgotten. Sleeping in ATM vestibules, eating restaurant leftovers, dodging cops who saw homeless elderly as a public health problem rather than human beings, but also observing, listening, learning. The streets have their own information networks, and the invisible like me can access data that the visible never obtain. I discovered that Michael had lied about the business as I suspected. He had used my money to pay gambling debts accumulated at underground casinos and loans from loan sharks who collect with violence. Madison had left him upon discovering his vices, threatening to expose his lies if he tried to contact her. Now he lived in a luxury apartment in Lincoln Park that he paid for with my retirement, bragging on social media about financial success that was pure theater built on my bones. But I also discovered something much more valuable. He wasn't his only victim. There was a network of scammed elderly that included Don Roberto, 78, who lost his savings for his wife's heart operation, and Mrs. Carmen, 81, scammed out of money for her disabled granddaughter's medications. Michael had a pattern, a method, a list of victims he had built systematically. Nobody expected that a group of elderly could organize for war. That was his second fatal mistake. Forming our revenge army was easier than I imagined. The elderly have something young people have lost: time, patience, and the terrible clarity of those who no longer have a future to protect. Don Roberto had been an accountant for 40 years at companies that handled dirty money, knew all the financial tricks, and had contacts in banks who owed him favors from the years when he helped them hide irregularities. Mrs. Carmen had worked 30 years in criminal courts, knew how the legal system worked from the inside, and had compromising information about judges, prosecutors, and lawyers she could use if necessary. I had my own resources, decades as a night security guard in neighborhoods where the city's real money moves, contacts with people who operate in the shadows and who respect veterans like me. Young people think technology is power, but we know that human relationships built over decades are heavy artillery. Michael had awakened the wrong generation, veterans of battles he couldn't even imagine. At our age, one learns that accumulated experience is a more lethal weapon than brute force or modern technology. The first phase of our operation was reconnaissance and intelligence. For weeks, we took turns watching Michael's every move, mapping his routines, identifying his vulnerable points, documenting his vices and weaknesses. Don Roberto used his banking contacts to track money flow, discovering that my grandson had opened accounts at 3 different banks to hide his transactions. Mrs. Carmen investigated his legal background and discovered he had previous fraud complaints that had been archived for lack of evidence, which really meant he had paid the right bribes. I infiltrated his social circle using techniques learned in my surveillance years. I posed as a lost old man in the neighborhood where he lived, struck up conversations with doormen, housekeepers, delivery boys, all the invisible people who see everything but whom nobody listens to. Gradually, we built a complete psychological profile. Michael was addicted to superficial success, dependent on social validation, terrified of the possibility of his fraud being discovered, and fundamentally cowardly when faced with real consequences. After so many years, one learns that knowing the enemy is more important than having weapons, and we knew him better than he knew himself. The second phase was sowing paranoia. We began with small interventions designed to destabilize his sense of security. Anonymous letters arriving at his apartment every 3 days, not with direct threats but with photos of us 3, accompanied by a single phrase, "We haven't forgotten." Silent calls at 3:17 a.m., the exact time he used to wake up with nightmares as a child when he lived with me. Wilted flowers deposited on his car door every morning, because I remembered that since childhood he hated seeing dead things. He began changing the locks on his apartment, looking nervously over his shoulder, posting less on social media. The smiles in his selfies looked forced. He had lost weight. His eyes showed the stress of someone living expecting the past to catch up. But this was just the warm-up, seeds of fear planted with the precision of someone who intimately knows the target's weaknesses. Young people don't understand that true torture isn't physical but psychological, and we had had decades to perfect the art of mental warfare. Michael still didn't know he was being hunted by specialists. The third phase was the most delicious. Turning his allies into enemies. I personally contacted the original creditors, those dangerous guys from the underground casinos and loan houses to whom Michael had paid using my stolen money. I explained to them, with documentary evidence that Don Roberto had meticulously prepared, that all their payments came from systematic scams against defenseless elderly. These men, who operate with very specific codes of honor about not harming grandparents, didn't react well to discovering they had been unwitting accomplices to something they considered the lowest form of criminality. Their response was educational for Michael. He began receiving very unfriendly nighttime visits, collection calls explaining that he now owed the money again because the original payments were stained with grandparents' blood. His attempts to explain that he had already paid were met with laughter and threats of escalated violence. While he began living in constant terror, I sat every afternoon in the coffee shop across from his building, visible from his window, drinking my coffee with the tranquility of someone who knows justice is working perfectly. Every time he looked down, he saw me there, motionless like a gargoyle, reminding him that the grandfather he had betrayed hadn't disappeared but had transformed into his worst nightmare. Anyone in my place would have felt that sweet satisfaction of seeing genuine fear grow in the traitor's eyes. But the master stroke came when Don Roberto discovered the information that would change the entire game. Using his contacts in the banking system, he had tracked not only Michael's accounts, but also his connections to other fraudulent operations. My grandson wasn't an amateur scammer. He was part of an organized network that specialized in scamming elderly using sophisticated psychological techniques. There were at least 12 more victims, including an 85-year-old woman with Alzheimer's who had been stripped of her family inheritance and a 79-year-old war veteran who lost his military pension. But the most revealing thing was discovering that Michael had a boss, a man named Richard Vega, 45, who ran the entire operation from a fake family investments office. Michael wasn't the criminal mastermind I had imagined. He was simply a dispensable pawn in a cruelty machine designed to destroy elderly people. That revelation filled me with a fury so pure that its intensity surprised me. I wasn't just going to destroy my traitorous grandson. I was going to dismantle the entire network that had turned him into a monster. After so many years, one learns that true revenge doesn't stop at the immediate target, but goes to the root of the problem. Richard Vega had signed his death sentence without knowing it. The fourth phase required planning that would have made any military strategist proud. Mrs. Carmen used her contacts in the judicial system to leak information about the scam network to the right prosecutors, those she knew had political ambitions and who would see this case as an opportunity to generate favorable headlines. But we didn't do it through official channels. Mrs. Carmen had compromising photos of certain officials in situations they would prefer to keep private, and used that information to ensure our case received absolute priority and unlimited resources. Simultaneously, Don Roberto prepared a financial dossier so detailed it included not only Michael's and Richard's accounts, but also those of their relatives, partners, contacts, a complete network of complicity that extended to banks, notaries, and government offices that had facilitated the scams in exchange for commissions. Meanwhile, I used my media contacts to ensure that when the time came for arrest, there would be cameras waiting and journalists prepared with the complete story. People of our generation understand something young people ignore. Public opinion is a more powerful weapon than any court, and we had built a narrative so perfect it would be impossible to defend. Michael and his boss were about to become the most hated villains in the country, and they didn't even know it. The day of final execution arrived like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. At 6 a.m., financial investigation teams simultaneously raided Richard Vega's offices, Michael's apartment, and 6 other locations related to the network. At 7 a.m., the media received a press release titled, "Network Dismantled That Stole Over $2 Million from Vulnerable Elderly." At 8 a.m., social media exploded with outrage when it was revealed that one of the scammers had specifically stolen from his own grandfather. At 9 a.m., Michael was arrested not in the privacy of his home but in the lobby of Chase Bank where he had signed my financial death sentence in front of all the employees who had witnessed my humiliation. I was there, front row, with the serene smile of someone watching a self-written prophecy fulfilled. When the handcuffs touched his wrists, our gazes met for the last time. In his eyes I saw the terror of the child he had been when he had nightmares, the late understanding that he had played with nuclear fire without knowing it. In mine, he saw something he had never seen before, the predator who had been sleeping inside the kind grandfather, waiting for the exact moment to awaken. "Grandpa, please, this is a mistake. I can explain," he shouted as officers dragged him toward the exit. I didn't respond. I just turned my back on him with the dignity of 72 years of experience in deserved consequences. Young people don't understand that we, people of our generation, when we close an emotional door, there are no keys that can open it. The child I had raised was officially dead to me. But my revenge was just beginning. While Michael rotted in a Cook County jail cell awaiting trial, I dedicated myself to systematically destroying everything that remained of his former life. I used my contacts to ensure the story reached every university where he had studied, every company where he had worked, every social club he had belonged to. His photo appeared on wanted posters in every elderly neighborhood in the city. I organized the victims to give heartbreaking interviews on television, telling how their own family members had betrayed them. The grandmother with Alzheimer's who had lost her inheritance appeared crying on camera, asking why her grandson-in-law had stripped her of the only memories she had left of her dead husband. The war veteran spoke about how he had risked his life for the country only to be betrayed by young people without honor. And I, as the most emblematic case, told my story with the broken dignity of someone who had given everything for love and received betrayal in return. Public opinion turned against Michael with a fury that exceeded my wildest expectations. He received death threats in prison. His name became synonymous with the worst kind of cowardice. Mothers used his story to teach their children about the consequences of ingratitude. At our age, one learns that destroying a reputation is more painful than any physical punishment, especially for someone who had based their self-esteem on social validation. Michael had lost not only his freedom, but his entire identity. 6 months after the arrest, while I lived comfortably in a new apartment in Rogers Park, paid for with the civil reparations we had won, I received a letter from jail. It was from Michael, written in shaky handwriting that reflected the mental state of someone who had been systematically broken. "Grandpa, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. Richard told me it was normal in families, that young people took money from the elderly because we knew better how to use it. He told me you would give it to me voluntarily if you knew what it was really for. He told me it was a way to honor you, to use your sacrifice to build something better. I know they were lies. I know I was an idiot. I know I destroyed the only real relationship I had in my life. But please, Grandpa, if there's anything left of the man who taught me values, help me understand how to repair this. I'm not asking you to forgive me, just tell me how I can live with what I did." I read the letter 3 times, feeling how each word tried to awaken the grandfather I had been. But that man had died the night I found the cruel note taped to my door. In his place, something purer, more honest had been born. A man who understood that some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness, but only fulfilled justice. I burned the letter without responding. After so many years, one learns that unreformed compassion is just weakness disguised as virtue. The trial was a spectacle of justice that filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't experienced since childhood. Michael received 12 years in federal prison for aggravated fraud, criminal association, and breach of trust. Richard Vega received 18 years as leader of the criminal organization. But more important than the sentences were the testimonies. Each scammed elderly person had their moment to face their torturers, to say truths they had been keeping during months of silent humiliation. Don Roberto spoke about how he had worked until age 76 to save money for his wife's operation, only to see how an unscrupulous young man stole it to gamble in casinos. Mrs. Carmen explained how she had sold family jewelry to pay for her disabled granddaughter's medications, money that ended up financing Michael's luxury vacations. And I had my final moment in front of the child I had raised, now dressed in orange prison uniform, handcuffed and surrounded by guards. "Michael," I told him with the firm voice of someone who had found peace in justice. "For 18 years I believed I was raising a man of honor. Today I understand I was feeding a parasite that used my love as fuel for his cruelty. I don't hate you because hate requires seeing something human in you. I simply erase you from my heart like an error is erased from memory." His tears didn't move me. Crocodiles also cry when captured. At our age, one learns to distinguish between real repentance and desperate manipulation. Now 2 years later, I live in a comfortable but modest apartment, surrounded by photographs of my true family, Don Roberto, Mrs. Carmen, and the other elderly who fought with me against injustice. Michael serves his sentence in Stateville Correctional Center, where criminals who hurt elderly receive the kind of justice that courts can't administer. The last news I had of him came through a guard I knew from my surveillance days. He had lost 30 pounds, suffered from severe depression, and spent most of his time in voluntary isolation to avoid other inmates who considered him the lowest form of criminal life. Richard Vega had attempted suicide twice, and now lived under constant psychiatric supervision. The scam network had been completely dismantled, resulting in the recovery of more than $3 million for scammed elderly throughout the country. But my true satisfaction doesn't come from their suffering, but from something deeper. The demonstration that underestimating a betrayed elderly person is the most costly mistake a dishonest young person can make. People of our generation may seem fragile on the outside, but we carry within us the strength of those who have survived everything life can throw against us. Michael learned, too late, that awakening an old wolf doesn't make you a hunter, it makes you prey. This morning, while drinking coffee on my balcony, watching the sunrise over the city that now respects the elderly, a little more thanks to our silent war, I received an unexpected call. It was the warden of the prison where Michael serves his sentence. "Mr. Thompson," he told me with a professional but tense voice, "I need to inform you that your grandson has been hospitalized after an incident with other inmates. He's asking to see you. He says he has important information that he can only tell you." For a moment, I felt how the ghost of the grandfather I had been tried to awaken in my chest. But that man had died 2 years ago on a cold street, betrayed by the person he loved most in the world. "Tell Michael," I responded with the tranquility of someone who has found peace in fulfilled justice, "that the grandfather he knew died the night he robbed me. What remains is me, and I don't have grandsons." I hung up the phone and continued drinking my coffee, watching how the sun illuminated a city where the elderly now walk with a little more dignity, knowing that some of us still remember how to roar. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks later, Don Roberto came to my apartment with a smile I hadn't seen since before our war began. In his hands, he had a thick folder full of legal documents. "Friend," he told me with eyes shining with satisfaction, "I have news that's going to make this day perfect." It turned out that Michael, desperate to reduce his sentence and terrified by the daily violence he faced in prison, had decided to cooperate with authorities to dismantle other scam networks operating in the country. His information had led to the arrest of more than 30 criminals and the recovery of almost $10 million stolen from elderly in 5 different states. But the most delicious part of all was that his cooperation had been interpreted by other inmates as betrayal, turning his prison life into a daily hell where every moment was a struggle to survive. "He wants to see us," Don Roberto continued. "He says he needs to ask our forgiveness in person to be able to live with himself." We both laughed with that bitter laugh of those who understand that some wounds don't heal with late apologies. At our age, one learns that repentance without consequences is just manipulation disguised as humility. The appointment at the prison was organized for a gray Tuesday in winter. Mrs. Carmen, Don Roberto and I showed up dressed in our best clothes, as if we were going to an important social event. In a sense we were. It was the coronation of our revenge, the moment when the circle would close completely. Michael arrived at the visiting room escorted by 2 guards, and his appearance impacted me more than I expected. He had lost so much weight he looked like a ghost of himself, had visible scars on arms and face, and his eyes showed the permanent terror of someone who lives every day expecting violence. But what surprised me most was seeing how he shrank when he saw me, as if he were a small child in front of an angry father. "Grandpa," he began with a broken voice, "I know I don't deserve to be in the same room as you, but I needed to tell you that." I interrupted him by raising a hand, using the same gesture I employed when he was a child and misbehaved. "Michael," I told him with the authority of 74 years of experience in deserved consequences, "we came here not to hear your apologies, but to make sure you completely understand the lesson you've learned. I want you to know," I continued while he trembled visibly, "that every day you suffer in this place is a gift I give you. I could have chosen to kill you that night under the bridge when I discovered what you had done. I have contacts who would have made your death look like an accident, but I chose something more refined, destroying your soul slowly, piece by piece, until you viscerally understand what it means to betray someone who loves you unconditionally." His tears began to fall, but I continued unmoved. "Every blow you receive from other inmates is my hand guiding them. Every night you can't sleep from fear is my voice whispering to you the consequences of your acts. Every time you look in the mirror and see a monster, you're seeing the truth I taught you to hide during 18 years of false love." Don Roberto and Mrs. Carmen nodded in silence, understanding this was my moment to close the emotional circle that had begun with my betrayal. People of our generation know that some lessons are only learned through prolonged suffering, and Michael was receiving the education he should have had since childhood. "But most importantly," I added, leaning forward so he could see the absolute coldness in my eyes, "I want you to know that your information about other criminal networks doesn't redeem you before me. You're not a hero for betraying your accomplices. You're simply a coward, trying to buy your survival with others' blood. The same cowardice that led you to steal from your grandfather is what now makes you betray your partners. You haven't changed, Michael. You've simply found new ways to be the same parasite you always were. His sobs intensified, but I felt only the cold satisfaction of someone watching a long-planned prophecy fulfilled. You have 10 more years of sentence ahead, I told him, standing up to leave, and I want you to spend every day of those 10 years remembering that this isn't coincidence or bad luck. This is justice designed specifically for you by the man who loved you more than anyone in the world and who decided to turn that betrayed love into your worst nightmare. After so many years, one learns that perfect revenge doesn't end with the enemy's death, but with their complete understanding of why they're suffering. When we got up to leave, Michael made one last desperate attempt. "Grandpa, please," he shouted with a voice that sounded exactly like when he was a child and had broken something valuable. "If you ever truly loved me, give me a chance to repair this. I'll do anything. I'll work my whole life to pay you back the money. I'll become the man you wanted me to be. Just give me one possibility." I stopped at the door and turned toward him one last time. At that moment, I saw two overlapping images: the 6-year-old boy who cried from nightmares and asked me to protect him from the world, and the 28-year-old man who had left me to die in the street like an animal. "Michael," I told him with the finality of someone closing a book forever, "the man who loved you died 2 years ago. What remains is me, and I don't believe in second chances for those who destroy their families for money. The child I raised is dead. The man I see here is just a stranger who wears his face and who will pay for his crimes until the last day of his life." I left that prison feeling lighter than I had felt in decades, as if I had deposited a burden I had been carrying since the day of his birth. 6 months after that visit, I received the news I had been unconsciously expecting. Michael had died in prison, apparently from a heart attack. Although rumors among my contacts suggested he had been helped by other inmates who had lost patience with his constant attempts to seek protection by collaborating with authorities. The news reached me while I was having dinner with Don Roberto, Mrs. Carmen, and other members of our veteran elderly network. When I read the message on my phone, I felt nothing, neither sadness nor joy nor relief. Only the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a natural cycle complete itself. "It's over," I told my battle companions, and everyone immediately understood what had happened. We toasted that night not for Michael's death, but for fulfilled justice, for the demonstration that betrayed elderly can be more dangerous than any professional criminal when they decide someone must pay for their crimes. At our age, one learns that death isn't a tragedy when it comes as a natural consequence of a life badly lived. The funeral was a surreal experience. I went, of course, because it was important for people to see that I had survived and prospered while my traitorous grandson decomposed underground. I was the only blood relative present. Madison didn't show up. His rich friends had disappeared years ago, and the only attendees were some penitentiary officials fulfilling protocol and 3 more elderly who had been scammed by him and wanted to make sure he was really dead. As the coffin lowered into the earth, I remembered all the times I had imagined that moment during my years raising him. I thought I would be the one to die first, surrounded by a grateful family, with Michael crying for the grandfather who had sacrificed everything for him. Instead, I was there as the sole witness to the burial of a criminal who had died alone, hated, and terrified. "Michael," I murmured while throwing dirt on his coffin, "I hope that wherever you are now you finally understand what it means to reap what you sow. Young people don't understand that we, people of our generation, can love so deeply that when that love becomes justice, it becomes as implacable as death itself." Today, 3 years after the day he stole my retirement and left me on the streets like a dog, I live a life I never imagined possible. My apartment is modest but comfortable, paid completely with the civil reparations we won against the criminal network. Don Roberto, Mrs. Carmen, and I have formed a non-governmental organization that helps scammed elderly recover their money and dignity. We have contacts in police, prosecutors' offices, media, and the penitentiary system that allow us to act quickly when we detect new cases of abuse against elderly. We're respected in neighborhoods where we were once invisible, feared by criminals who once saw us as easy prey, and consulted by authorities who now understand that underestimating the intelligence and determination of the elderly is a mistake that can cost entire careers. But more important than all that, I've found a peace I hadn't known in decades, the tranquility that comes from knowing I defended my honor and that of my generation against those who thought they could destroy us with impunity. Some nights, when the silence of my apartment allows me to reflect, I think about the child Michael was before becoming the monster who betrayed me. I remember his first steps, his first words, the way he curled up against me when he had nightmares. Those memories no longer hurt because I've learned to separate them completely from the criminal he became. The child I loved really existed, but died long before the man who carried his name. My mistake was confusing one with the other for too many years. Grandfathers tend to see our grandchildren as permanent extensions of the children they were. But the reality is that some people choose to become monsters regardless of how much love they receive in their childhood. Michael chose to be a parasite, and I chose to be the poison that would eliminate him from the world. After so many years, one learns that accepting the reality of those we love is more important than preserving comfortable illusions about their non-existent goodness. They stole my retirement money and left me on the streets like a dog. They thought at 72 I couldn't fight back, but they regretted it until their last day. This is my story, dear reader. The story of a grandfather who was betrayed by the person he loved most in the world, who lost everything he had built in 72 years of honest life, but who demonstrated that age doesn't weaken the capacity to fight, but perfects it. Today's young people believe that being elderly means being helpless, but we know something they haven't learned yet. That experience accumulated over decades is the most lethal weapon that exists, especially when combined with the moral clarity of someone who no longer has a future to protect. Michael made the fatal mistake of awakening an old wolf who had been sleeping for years, believing that gray hair meant weakness. He learned too late that betrayed elderly don't seek revenge, they seek justice, and the difference between both is that justice doesn't stop until the universe's balance has been completely restored. To all the young people who read this story, I give one warning: respect your grandparents, not just out of love, but for survival. We, people of our generation, have survived wars, dictatorships, economic crises, family losses, and decades of struggle you can't imagine. That survival has taught us lessons about justice, patience, and determination that we would prefer not to use against our own families. But if you force us to choose between being victims and being hunters, we will choose to be hunters with the accumulated experience of 70 years of life. And that, dear grandchildren of the world, is a choice you won't want us to make. Because when a grandfather decides someone must pay for their crimes, that someone doesn't just pay, they disappear from the world with the silent efficiency of someone who has had decades to plan the perfect revenge. But my story has one final chapter that I haven't told you yet. Last month, on the 3rd anniversary of Michael's death, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a letter and a small wooden box. The letter was from Madison, Michael's ex-wife, whom I hadn't heard from since their divorce. Her words still echo in my mind. "Mr. Thompson, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I felt I owed you an explanation. 3 years ago, when Michael died in prison, I inherited his personal effects. Among them was this box, which he had asked me to keep safe, in case something happened to him. Inside, I found letters he had written to you but never sent, and something else that I think you need to see. I spent these 3 years debating whether to contact you, but recent events convinced me it was necessary. You see, Mr. Thompson, I'm getting married again, to a good man who has a teenage grandson he's raising alone. When I told him about Michael's story and what happened to you, he went pale. Madison, he told me, that could have been me and my grandson. That's when I realized this box doesn't just contain Michael's regrets, it contains a warning for all of us." I opened the wooden box with trembling hands. Inside were 17 letters, all addressed to me, written during Michael's time in prison. The first one was dated just 2 weeks after his arrest. I read them all, one by one, watching how my grandson had slowly deteriorated from denial to desperation to a kind of broken clarity. In the last letter, written just 3 days before his death, he wrote, "Grandpa, I know you'll never read this, but I need to write it anyway. I understand now what you tried to teach me about consequences. Every day in here, I see what I became reflected in the eyes of other inmates who despise me. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness because I know I destroyed that possibility the day I stole from you. I'm writing to tell you that you were right about everything, You were right that love without respect is worthless. You were right that family isn't just blood, but loyalty. You were right that a man's character is shown in how he treats those who love him unconditionally. I failed every test you prepared me for, and now I pay the price. But I need you to know something. Even in this hell, even facing death every day, I finally understand that you didn't destroy me out of hate. You destroyed me out of love. Twisted, terrible love, but love nonetheless. You loved me enough to make sure I learned the lesson, even if it killed me. I hope that wherever you are, you found peace. And I hope that other grandsons reading this story understand what I understood too late, that disappointing a grandfather who loves you isn't just betrayal, it's suicide. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was something that made my blood freeze. It was a small recorder, the kind Michael used for his college assignments years ago. With shaking hands, I pressed play. Michael's voice, weak and frightened, filled my apartment. If someone finds this recording, it means I didn't survive prison. My name is Michael Thompson, and I want to confess something that the authorities don't know. My grandfather, Harold Thompson, didn't just accidentally discover my scam network. He orchestrated my destruction with surgical precision that would make the FBI proud. But here's what terrifies me. He was right to do it. Every step he took, every move he made, was justified by what I did to him. I robbed the man who sacrificed everything for me, and he made sure I paid a price that fit the crime. If there are other young people listening to this, thinking they can take advantage of their elderly relatives, listen carefully. Don't wake up the old wolves. They have resources, contacts, and patience you can't imagine. And most importantly, they have nothing left to lose. My grandfather turned my betrayal into a masterclass on consequences. He didn't just punish me, he educated me. And that education cost me everything, as it should have. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Michael detailing every step of my revenge that he had figured out, expressing a mixture of terror and admiration for what I had accomplished. But what chilled me most was his final message. Grandpa, if you ever hear this, know that I finally understand. You didn't become a monster to destroy me. You revealed the monster I had always been. The difference is that your monster served justice, while mine served only greed. I hope my death brings you the peace you deserve, and I hope my story serves as a warning to others. Never underestimate the love of a grandfather, because when you betray it, it becomes the most dangerous force in the universe. I sat in my armchair for hours after the recording ended, feeling emotions I couldn't name. Part of me felt vindicated. Michael had finally understood. But another part, a small part that still remembered the child he had been, felt something that might have been sadness. Not for the man he became, but for the boy who could have been something different. That night, I called Don Roberto and Mrs. Carmen. We met at our usual diner, the one where we had planned Michael's downfall 3 years ago. I played them the recording, and we sat in silence when it ended. So Mrs. Carmen finally said, "He understood at the end." "Understanding doesn't equal forgiveness," Don Roberto replied. "Some lessons come too late to matter." I nodded, but found myself thinking about Madison's words, about her new husband and his grandson, about all the grandfathers and grandchildren who might read this story and learn from it before it's too late. "You know what I think?" I said finally. "I think Michael's final gift wasn't his understanding. It was his warning to others. Maybe that's worth something." The next day, I did something I never thought I would do. I sat down at my computer and began typing, not my story this time, but a letter. A letter to every grandfather and grandmother reading this, and to every grandchild who might still have time to choose differently. To the grandfathers reading this, we are not helpless. Age has given us resources that youth lacks: patience, contacts, experience, and the terrible clarity of those who have nothing left to lose. But before you use those resources for destruction, make sure destruction is truly necessary. Some battles can still be won with love, if we're wise enough to fight them early. To the grandchildren reading this, your grandparents are not banks with legs. They are not obstacles to your success. They are not outdated relics whose opinions don't matter. They are wolves who have chosen to be sheep for your sake. Don't mistake their gentleness for weakness, their love for stupidity, their sacrifice for obligation. When you betray a grandparent's love, you don't just hurt an old person. You awaken something that has survived decades of hardship and learn to turn love into the most surgical form of justice. The choice is yours. Learn from Michael's story or become it. I published that letter online, along with this story. Within a week, it had been shared thousands of times. I began receiving messages from grandparents who recognized themselves in my experience, and from young people who said it made them call their grandparents to apologize for taking them for granted. But the message that affected me most came from a 19-year-old named David. Mr. Thompson, I was planning to steal my grandmother's Social Security checks to pay off my drug debts. After reading your story, I realized I was about to make the same mistake as Michael. Instead, I confessed everything to my grandmother and asked for help getting clean. She cried, but she helped me. I'm in rehab now, and I think about your story every day. Thank you for saving me from becoming another Michael. That's when I understood that Michael's death hadn't been meaningless. His story, combined with mine, had become a weapon against the kind of betrayal that had destroyed him. Not a weapon of revenge, but of prevention. The final lesson is this. We old wolves prefer to remain sheep because we love our cubs. But when our cubs mistake our love for weakness and our sacrifice for stupidity, they force us to show them what we really are. We are survivors who have learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching the hardest lesson, even if it destroys us both in the process. This is my story. This is Michael's warning. This is our gift to grandparents and grandchildren everywhere. The knowledge that love betrayed becomes justice, and justice once awakened never sleeps again. Remember this, dear reader. Never wake up the old wolves. We have been hunting since before you were born, and we know how to make our prey disappear without a trace. But most importantly, remember that we don't want to hunt our own cubs. Give us a reason to remain sheep, and we will love you until our last breath. Force us to become wolves, and we will teach you lessons that will echo through eternity. The choice, as always, is yours.